It's the late summer of 1862, and the Confederacy is on a roll. General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia had just humiliated yet another Union army at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Washington, D.C. was bordering on pure panic. For Lee, this was the moment. He saw his chance. He believed the Union was demoralized, and its armies were a mess. It was time to take the war north. So on September 4th, Lee's army started crossing the Potomac River into Maryland. This was a monumental gamble with audacious goals. First, he had to resupply his ragged, starving army from the untouched farms of the North, which would also give war-torn Virginia a desperately needed break to harvest its crops. Second, he wanted to shatter Northern morale. Congressional elections were just around the corner, and the Confederate army operating freely on Union soil could terrify the public, empower anti-war Democrats, and maybe even force Abraham Lincoln to the negotiating table. But there was a third, even bigger prize: foreign recognition. A decisive victory up north might finally convince Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy, providing the money and materials Lee needed to win the whole war. It was a campaign born of desperation and genius, a single roll of the dice to secure Southern independence. As Lee himself wrote to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, "I am aware that the movement is attended with much risk, yet I do not consider success impossible." He was marching north, looking for one great battle to end it all. The Union commander, Major General George B. McClellan, was a brilliant organizer, but also a deeply, almost pathologically, cautious man. He constantly thought Lee's army was bigger than it was, and he was terrified of failure. Then, fate handed him a miracle. In a stunning stroke of luck, Union soldiers found a copy of Lee's detailed invasion plan special, Order 191, casually wrapped around 3 cigars. The intelligence was a godsend. It laid out the exact locations of all of Lee's scattered forces. McClellan knew he could trap and destroy the Confederate army, piece by piece. He even said, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." And yet, he hesitated, and that hesitation would cost thousands of lives. The Battle of Antietam wasn't one single fight. It was 3 separate acts of slaughter that unfolded across the rolling Maryland landscape. It all started at dawn in a 24-acre cornfield belonging to a farmer named David Miller. Union forces under General Joseph Hooker slammed into Stonewall Jackson's Confederates. For 3 hours, the field was a pure maelstrom of lead and iron. The corn, which stood as tall as a man, was shredded into nothing. Artillery rained down, while regiments charged and countercharged, firing at point-blank range. In just this opening phase, the two sides racked up nearly 14,000 casualties. Some regiments lost over half their men in minutes. It was a brutal, swirling stalemate that left the cornfield littered with a horrifying mix of blue and grey. As the morning dragged on, the battle shifted south to a sunken farm lane that created a natural trench. Here, a few thousand Confederates dug in and waited. For almost 4 hours, they held off wave after wave of Union attacks. The fighting was intimate, close, and absolutely gruesome. From their protected position, the Confederates unleashed devastating volleys that ripped through the Union ranks. But the Federals just kept coming, their numbers eventually overwhelming the defenders. When the Confederates finally broke and ran, the lane was so full of the dead and wounded that it earned a new, ghastly name, Bloody Lane. By midday, another 5,500 men had fallen in and around that sunken road. The final act of the battle took place that afternoon, on the southern end of the field, at a stone bridge crossing Antietam Creek. Union General Ambrose Burnside and his corps were ordered to strike Lee's right flank. But the narrow bridge, defended by just a few hundred Georgian riflemen on the high ground, became a deadly choke point. 4 hours, Burnside's men tried and failed to cross, taking terrible losses with every attempt. Finally, after a series of desperate charges, They took the bridge and started pushing toward the vulnerable Confederate rear. For a moment, it looked like the Union was on the verge of a crushing victory. Lee's army was shattered, with its back to the Potomac and nowhere left to run. He had thrown almost every man into the fight. But just as the Union attack gained momentum, Confederate General A.P. Hill's division arrived after a grueling forced march from Harper's Ferry. They smashed right into Burnside's exposed flank, stopping the Union advance cold and saving Lee's army from total destruction. As dusk fell, the fighting sputtered out. The guns fell silent, replaced by the cries of thousands upon thousands of wounded men scattered across the fields. The next day, September 18th, the two armies just stared at each other across a field of death. Lee's army was crippled. He'd lost a quarter of his men. McClellan, despite his own heavy losses, still had a huge numerical advantage and fresh reserves ready to fight. This was the moment, the chance to destroy the army of Northern Virginia and maybe, just maybe, end the war. President Lincoln begged him to attack, but McClellan, ever the cautious general, convinced himself Lee had 100,000 men hiding somewhere and did nothing. That night, under the cover of darkness, Lee's battered army slipped back across the Potomac into Virginia. In military terms, the battle was a draw, but strategically, because Lee's invasion was over, it was a Union victory. And for President Abraham Lincoln, that was all he needed. 4 months, Lincoln had been waiting. The war, originally fought just to preserve the Union, wasn't going well. Abolitionists were pressuring him to strike at slavery itself, the very institution that fueled the Confederate war machine. Back in July, he had drafted a document that would change everything. But his cabinet warned him, wait for a victory. Issuing it after a string of defeats would sound like, in their words, the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help. Antietam, as bloody and inconclusive as it was the victory Lincoln needed. 5 days after the battle, on September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was a warning shot. It declared that if the Southern states didn't rejoin the Union by New Year's Day, all enslaved people within those rebellious states shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And this is where the bloodiest day got worse. The proclamation didn't immediately free a single enslaved person. Since it only applied to territory the Union didn't actually control. What it did do was fundamentally transform the entire purpose of the war. This was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a war for human freedom. To many, this was a horrifying turn. Some Union soldiers actually deserted, refusing to risk their lives for abolition. In the South, it was seen as an evil plot to incite a slave rebellion and destroy their entire way of life. It vaporized any lingering hope for a negotiated peace. By changing the stakes, Lincoln ensured the war would be fought to a bitter, unconditional end. It was no longer a limited political conflict. It had become a moral crusade, a revolutionary fight for the soul of the nation. The proclamation also opened the door for black men to serve in the Union Army, and nearly 200,000 would eventually enlist to fight for their own freedom, adding a powerful new force to the war. The Battle of Antietam was the price of emancipation. Those nearly 23,000 casualties weren't just a grim statistic. They were the down payment for a brand new war aim. The staggering carnage gave President Lincoln the political cover he needed to take a step he called a military necessity, a way to break the back of the rebellion by striking at its economic foundation. So, the battle's true legacy isn't the bloody stalemate on the field, but the revolution it unleashed. It transformed a war of policy into a war of principle. It ensured that, if the Union won, it would mean the end of slavery and the birth of a new, though deeply scarred, American republic. The bloodiest day in American history didn't end the horror. It deepened it, paving the way for 2.5 more years of brutal fighting. but for a cause that would ultimately change the world. If you found this story about the hidden consequences of history compelling, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We love digging into these moments. Let us know in the comments what other battles or historical turning points you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching.